In the forgotten corridors of human memory, where the dust of centuries rests on stones that once saw blood flow like rivers, looms the shadow of the Bible's cruelest kings, men who transformed the throne into an altar of sacrifice and the scepter into a blade of terror. Kings who ruled not only by the weight of the crown, but by the fear that exuded from every gesture, every sentence, every look, charged with divine wrath or carnal whim. Their cities were labyrinths of opulence and suffering. Their palaces were fortresses built on tears. Their beds were temples where desire mingled with curse. In the silence of the early morning, while torches flickered against stone walls, women conspired in whispers, priests invoked foreign gods, and branded slaves bore the weight of a lust that knew no bounds. These kings not only ruled peoples, they shaped destinies, destroyed lineages, tore apart pacts with the Creator himself, and dared to toy with that which was sacred. Each banquet was an omen, each ritual a plunge into invisible abysses, each night a forbidden confession that should never have been heard, but which will now be revealed, without veils, without mercy, like an open wound before the eyes that dare to remain until the end of this narrative. But what few know, what the scribes did not dare record on their tablets, is that behind the cruelty of these kings lay a hidden secret, buried among burned parchments and nameless bones, a silent pact that united blood, desire, and idolatry in a single curse that echoed through the centuries. At the end of this journey, when every detail is exposed, you will discover that these men fell not only by the sword of their enemies or the weight of their sins, but by a force older, deeper, more feminine, an invisible chain that bound them and led them to ruin. And this revelation, kept silent by those who feared its truth, will be unveiled here, in this video, as the confession that should never have reached you. The ancient pages breathe like open wounds, and when one returns to the days when kings ruled Israel and Judah with iron hands and poisoned hearts, the air becomes heavy, as if the earth itself still bore the weight of their footsteps. Amid arid deserts exuding suffocating heat and walled cities that gleamed in the sun like mirages of gold and dust, thrones stood, not just symbols of leadership, but instruments of absolute domination. Iron gates creaked at dawn, soldiers marched in rhythmic ranks, and the people bowed before the figure of the king, not out of sincere devotion but out of fear. The sound of drums and trumpets echoed through the squares, while messengers announced decrees that brooked no dispute. It was a time when law was the will of a single man, and his word carried the weight of life or death. The streets reeked of the scent of spices mixed with the stench of blood spilled in public executions. Children grew up seeing heads displayed at the city gates, silent reminders that disobedience had a price. Inside the palaces, tapestries embroidered with purple threads hid walls that had once witnessed muffled cries of supplication. The nights were lit by torches that cast distorted shadows on the columns, shadows that seemed to dance in secret rituals, shadows that held stories never recorded by the scribes. The heart of these kingdoms beat to the rhythm of war, lust, and idolatry. Each military conquest was celebrated with banquets where wine flowed like rivers. Each defeat was punished with the merciless lash of vengeance. Foreign gods brought by political alliances shared space with the name of the God of Israel, and on hidden altars burned the incense that sealed the fate of an entire people. Women, sometimes queens adorned in gold, sometimes prisoners disguised in silk, moved through the corridors like living shadows of an invisible power, a power that grew in silence, in glances, in touches, in promises. There was something hypnotic about this atmosphere, a fusion between the gleam of gold and the smell of fear, between the chanting of the Levites in the temple and the forbidden songs on secret altars, between the echo of the king's footsteps on marble and the muffled groans of the victims of his wrath. It was as if every stone, every wall, every breath of wind carried a memory, and each memory was an indictment against those who dared to proclaim themselves lords of the chosen people. There, where the desert dust met the shadow of the palaces, a narrative of power was born that was not merely political or military, but spiritual, visceral, erotic, and cruel. And it is in this scenario that the burning question arises: was absolute power sustained solely by the sword and the army? Or were there more subtle, more obscure forces that shaped every decision, every sentence, every gesture of cruelty? Perhaps the answer lies in the invisible marks left by those who shared the king's bed, by those who served silently in the courtyards, by those who dared to whisper conspiracies on moonlit nights. And when one looks closely at the traces left, one realizes that the true stage of history was not just in battles or decrees, but in the corridors where power mingled with desire, and the sacred was contaminated by the profane. Ultimately, the cruelty of these kings was not simply a reflection of their own nature, but the result of a deeper game, a board where each piece played a calculated role, where even silence was strategy, and where the blood that stained the ground was not just the fruit of war, but the pleasure of ruling as gods incarnate. And you, hearing these words, can sense that there is still something unsaid, as if this story concealed layers buried beneath centuries of silence, waiting to be unveiled before attentive eyes like yours. Architecture was not just stone and mortar, but a secret language carved to subdue minds and hearts, an invisible code that spoke through soaring columns, endless corridors and halls, where every detail held calculated purpose. The king's palace was more than a residence. It was a theater of power, a temple erected in the monarch's own image, and those who dared to cross its gates knew they were entering a world where everything breathed authority. The marble floors reflected not only the light of torches, but the weight of hierarchy. The lofty thrones, encrusted with gold and rare stones, were not mere seats, but symbolic mountains from where a single man looked down upon his subjects as a deity in flesh. The walls, adorned with tapestries chronicling military victories and amorous conquests, served as mirrors of glory and cruelty. Each scene embroidered with red thread was not merely decorative, but a visual memory engraved to intimidate and inspire awe. The space was designed to inspire reverence. Those who entered the halls had to walk long distances to approach the king, forced to feel the physical distance that symbolized the spiritual abyss between ruler and ruled. This distance was calculated to fuel the idea that the sovereign was always beyond, unreachable, distant, untouchable. The harem chambers, hidden behind carved cedar doors, comprised another dimension of this architectural universe. Not just private spaces, but secret chambers of power, where silence mingled with the scent of incense and where alliances were sealed on women's bodies. The inner courtyards, with fountains gushing crystal-clear water, were not mere works of beauty, but symbols of fertility, wealth, and mastery over the elements. Even the shadows of the columns were cast to remind everyone that the king's authority rested in every detail, every space, every breath within the walls. And there was no coincidence. The architects who built these palaces understood the mystique of power. Every door taller than a man, every dome reflecting the sky, every statue of winged lions and bulls guarding entrances. The visitor not only saw, but felt in their bones that they were standing before something greater than themselves, before a king who presented himself as a reflection of divine order. Within the most restricted chambers, where only advisors and priests had access, secret altars burned with discreet fires, blending rituals of devotion with practices the scribes preferred not to record. The throne was not only made of gold, but also of symbols, carved cherubs, mythical animals representing strength, precious stones evoking eternity. There seated, the king didn't need to raise his voice. The space itself spoke for him. Anyone who dared to look into this man's eyes realized they were in an invisible prison, in an architectural spectacle designed to make any thought of rebellion impossible. But perhaps most fascinating was realizing that power lay not only in the grandiose space, but in the intimacy of the hidden passages. Underground tunnels connected secret rooms, hidden staircases allowed the king to appear where he was, not expected, surprising subjects and wives as if he were an omnipresent spirit. This architecture was not just stone, it was a staged mystery, the materialization of a political theater that blended fear, lust, and religiosity. And in the face of such splendor, the nagging question remains: did those who built such monuments believe they were serving a king of flesh and blood, or were they, in truth, erecting altars to something darker, a force that fed on blood and submission? If every stone holds a whisper, perhaps the answer still lies hidden in the silent ruins of these palaces, where the night wind insists on singing stories that should not be remembered. Power was not sustained solely by the sword or the walls surrounding cities, but by the invisible art of transforming desire into a political instrument, of converting the body into diplomatic currency, and of using the royal bed as a chamber for silent negotiations. The most cruel kings of the Bible understood that a covenant, written on parchment, could be broken, but an alliance sealed by the touch of flesh, by the lingering gaze of a foreign wife, by the whisper of promises in the ear during the night, had far more lasting power. Thus, marriages were not merely celebrations of non-existent love, but strategic pacts, treaties disguised as sacred ceremonies, where each woman carried in her womb not only the hope of children, but the possibility of founding empires. Princesses from distant lands carried the dust of their nations in their braided hair, the brilliance of their cities in their heavy necklaces, and in their eyes the cunning of mothers and priestesses who had instructed them from an early age. To seduce was to rule, to win the king's heart was to dominate his throne. Each foreign wife brought with her more than a dowry. She brought gods, customs, dialects, mysteries, and in sleeping with the king, she also slept with the shadow of his people, penetrating the walls of a kingdom by a path more efficient than any army. They were women who understood that their nudity wasn't just an exposed body, but sacred territory, a frontier of power, a space where wars were decided and invisible alliances were forged. Their presence in the palace corridors was like lingering perfumes. They exuded promise but hid poison. While banquets were held for ambassadors and generals, it was in the silence of their bedrooms that destinies were forged. The kiss was treated as a document, the handover as a signature. There was a cold calculation in these women's eyes, as if each gesture were a move in a larger chess game, the touch of a hand on a wine glass, the intertwining of fingers during a ceremonial dance, the whisper in a foreign language understood only by the king. All these became tools of domination, and the king, even if he believed himself absolute lord, became hostage to bonds woven by delicate hands and sharp minds. Scribes recorded the names of kings with pomp and solemnity, but rarely dared to write about these queens, wives, and concubines who acted as powerful shadows. Yet one need only observe the course of history. Kingdoms opened to foreign gods, political decisions made after nights of intimacy, wars declared or averted because of a whispered request. The politics of desire was not theory, but an invisible practice that shaped the world beneath the veneer of masculine glory. And in this network of female alliances, there was rivalry and complicity, seduction and strategy. Each woman represented not only herself, but also carried on her shoulders the weight of her lineage and the expectations of a people. Yet, while some saw this as a burden, others discovered a weapon. And it was through this silent weapon that the cruelest kings were led to choices that would have seemed insane in the eyes of the prophets, but which were perfectly understandable in the light of desire. And so, when one looks at the history of these men, one realizes that they never ruled alone. At their sides, or rather over their bodies, also reigned women who knew how to transform nights into treaties and sighs into sentences. And perhaps true power, the one that remains invisible to official records, lay not in the illuminated halls, but in the dark rooms where flesh became political language and pleasure transformed into a silent weapon. There was an ancient science, an unwritten liturgy that preceded each night in the king's bedchamber, a set of rituals that blended the pursuit of beauty with the invocation of the sacred, as if the woman's body were both temple and offering. The baths held in white marble chambers were more than hygiene. They were ceremonies in which water, brought from secret springs or collected in gleaming bronze jars, flowed over the skin as if carrying with it the dust of sins and the weight of waiting. Women gathered in silence, helping each other remove heavy fabrics, immersing themselves in waters perfumed with essences of spikenard, myrrh, and saffron, substances so precious they were worth more than silver coins. There, with each drop running down the body, it was not only dirt that dissolved, but also memories, fears, and even their former identity, for at the end of the ritual the woman no longer belonged to herself, but to the king who awaited her. After the baths came the anointings. The hands of the servants, trained from youth, glided slowly over the skin, spreading rare oils that exuded fragrances, capable of intoxicating the senses. Each touch was measured, each pressure had meaning, activating the blood, awakening the flesh, preparing the body to become weapon and altar. The fragrances mingled in the air, creating a thick, almost intoxicating atmosphere that permeated not only the corridors of the harem, but also the memories of those who passed through. It is said that the scent of myrrh could linger on the skin for months, as if marking the woman with an invisible seal, reminding the king of her presence even after countless others had passed through the same bed. Fabrics were chosen with care, not only for their beauty, but for the message they conveyed. Transparent linens, silks brought from distant lands, veils dyed purple and scarlet, colors that evoked blood, royalty, and mystery. When dressing, a woman did not cover herself, but revealed herself in layers, transforming the simple act of walking before the king into a calculated spectacle of power. Jewelry glittered like stars attached to flesh, gold bracelets, heavy necklaces, earrings that tinkled softly with every movement, creating a rhythm of seduction that mesmerized attentive ears. And there were also whispered words, ancient prayers, blessings murmured by priestesses who understood the weight of these rituals. It wasn't just about enchanting a man, but about invoking the blessing of gods and spirits so that the union would be fertile, so that wombs would become political weapons, so that children would be born as heirs who would seal invisible alliances. Ancestral wisdom passed from mouth to mouth, transmitted like a feminine secret, how to walk, how to look, how to breathe before the king. Each gesture, seemingly natural, was the fruit of generations of women who learned that seduction is not just instinct, but honed knowledge. The preparation, therefore, was not merely physical, it was spiritual. It was the transformation of a woman into an entity, from body into symbol, from desire into dominion. When she passed through the golden doors that led her to the royal bed, she did not enter alone. She entered accompanied by the voices of her ancestors, the weight of her lineage, the expectation of her people. The silence itself seemed to accompany every step, as if the corridors were listening, as if the walls recorded the invisible rituals that preceded the encounters of pleasure. And so, when the king received this woman, prepared to the core, it was not just flesh that was offered to him, but an entire universe, a spell crafted with scents, fabrics, gestures, and mysteries. It was the triumph of feminine art that knew how to transform the act of bedding into a sacred and political ceremony, a spectacle of power that the king believed he dominated, but which in reality dominated him. The king's chamber was not merely a resting place, but the beating heart of a hidden empire, a temple built not of stone, but of fabrics, scents, and sounds, capable of shaping the will of the most powerful men. When the doors closed, the outside world disappeared, and the space transformed into a liturgy of seduction, where every detail was calculated to dissolve resistance, to intoxicate the senses, to hold the monarch hostage to something stronger than his own crown. The torches were covered by translucent veils that filtered the light in golden and reddish hues, creating dancing shadows reminiscent of the flames of a sacred fire, as if the room itself were a burning altar. On dark wooden tables rested jugs of perfumed wine, ripe fruit exuding forbidden sweetness, and goblets carved with symbols of fertility. Fabrics spread across the room like waves of a colorful sea. Persian rugs, purple curtains, cushions embroidered with gold thread, each exuding stories of conquered peoples, of tribes seduced by the promise of unity. The air was always thick, charged with incense that rose in invisible spirals, blending resins, spices, and oils that burned slowly, creating an atmosphere that intoxicated like sweet poison. Even the sound was part of the enchantment. Soft harps plucked in the distance, low-pitched flutes, repetitive rhythms that plunged the mind into a trance. The monumental bed was not just a bed, but a horizontal throne, a cedar bedstead inlaid with precious stones, covered with the finest sheets, white as snow, adorned with crimson threads that evoked blood and passion. There, the king lay not as a sovereign, but as an initiate into a mystery, as a priest before an offering. Each time a woman entered that space, she did so not merely as a wife, concubine, or lover. She was a priestess bringing with her ancestral rites, carrying in her gestures the weight of a millennia-old heritage that united eroticism and spirituality. Symbols multiplied silently, statues of lions representing strength and domination, winged figures recalling the watchfulness of the heavens, vases filled with flowers that slowly withered throughout the night, recalling the fragility of flesh. Every detail was a metaphor, every object a silent whisper, reinforcing the idea that here, not just two bodies, but worlds, cultures, gods, and curses were united. The king's chamber was a laboratory of alliances, an invisible battlefield where blood flowed not in rivers, but in future descendants, in political decisions fueled by pleasure. And there was something more, the feeling that the room was watching, that the walls absorbed moans and confessions, that the shadows were silent witnesses to forbidden secrets. The king believed himself master, but he became a disciple of a theater carefully constructed by female hands, by occult traditions, by forces no scribe would dare record. When dawn dissolved into birdsong and the torch's flames died away, the king awoke not only satisfied, but marked, transformed, bewitched. The temple of seduction was not a place of rest, but of consecration. It was there, in the silence between one sigh and the next, that the destinies of peoples were decided. War maps were drawn, unwritten pacts were forged, and so each night became an offering, each touch a decree, each surrender a sacrifice. The king's chamber was the forge where pleasure shaped empires, and where absolute power bowed before the silent art of seduction. Nothing was as silent or as brutal as the war waged between the women of the palace, a battle without trumpets or banners, waged with perfumes and veils, with glances. That seemed like caresses but hid blades, with calculated gestures that shifted the axis of power a millimeter each night. At dawn, when the courtyards were still damp with dew and the singing of the servants echoed like a distant prayer, the invisible movements began. A gift sent to the rival chamber with a deliberately flawed stone inlaid, a story whispered in the ear of a maid who would repeat it unintentionally, a subtle change in the order of visits so that the king would associate a perfume with a decision, a song with a memory, a touch with a decree. Nothing was random, everything was a choreography of intentions. Alliances blossomed like nocturnal flowers, blooming where no one saw. Two concubines exchanging matching bracelets to signify a secret pact, a foreign queen offering another a rare ointment, the promise of protection inside the vial, a mother teaching her daughter to smile without showing her teeth so it would never be interpreted as weakness. There were codes for everything, the way to hold the cup, the speed with which the veil was raised, the number of steps to the throne before stopping, the tilt of the neck at the sound of a general's name. Whoever understood the grammar of these signals ruled, even without a crown. Espionage didn't wear armor, it wore silk. Servants shared rooms, masseuses who knew more about war than the counselors themselves, musicians who tuned instruments while memorizing guard routes and audience times, a lost earring in. The hallway signaled passage through a forbidden door. A forgotten comb on the counselor's desk revealed the true master of the day's schedule. Sometimes the blade came disguised as a cure, a tea that soothed but delayed, a salve that smelled but stung, a necklace that was too heavy to bow the neck in submission. Evil had the touch of a feather. The king, confident in his strength, did not realize that his will was bent like metal in a secret forge. All it took was for one woman to postpone a meeting and another to bring it forward, for the signature of an agreement to change its ink. All it took was for a certain chant to be repeated in the antechamber, for childhood memories to return, and with them, an inherited prejudice. All it took was for a favorite dish to suddenly appear, for one emissary to be received instead of another. The bed was the board, the sheets the squares, the bodies the pieces. Victory almost always seemed coincidental, and as in every war, there were wounds and exiles. Those who lost the king's favor were not only forgotten, they were slowly erased, transferred to more distant quarters, deprived of the finest fabrics, the thick anointings, the sacred chants at dusk. Their faces grew pale, their eyes lost their luster, their perfume became a memory. Some resigned themselves and found refuge in hidden prayers. Others sharpened their claws and re-emerged with new tactics, a new ally, a son newly promised to the study of the scribes, a devout priest, ready to anoint the appropriate name. Deep down, each woman fought two battles, the external one against the others, and the internal one against the mirror that demanded youth, fertility, mystery, docility, and ferocity in impossible doses. And despite the theater of silk and gold, the sound that lingered when the torches went out was the pent-up breath of those who had narrowly won, and those who, defeated, already planned to win tomorrow. On nights like these, history changed by a comma, and a comma there could open an abyss. There is one detail, however, that always escapes those observing from the outside. In what almost invisible gesture did one of them tilt the entire fate of a kingdom? Was it the abandoned earring, the overly sweet tea, the 3-beat delay on the drum? Whoever grasps this precise point sees the real machinery working within. Children were born not merely as fruits of love or chance encounters, but as carefully planned weapons, living pieces on an invisible chessboard that extended far beyond the palace walls. Each pregnancy was celebrated or feared as an omen. Each growing womb carried within it the promise of continuity, but also the threat of ruin. Within the harem, the murmur of the servants mingled with songs of blessing, and at the same time with whispers of intrigue. Which son would inherit the throne? Which mother would guarantee her blood the right to rule? Which woman would be remembered in the songs of the scribes and which would fall into oblivion? Children were received as gifts and immediately transformed into instruments. From the cradle, they were surrounded by symbols. Talismans hung above their heads, prayers chanted in foreign languages, promises made to gods hidden in their mothers' secret altars. The struggle was not limited to the moment of birth, but extended to education, the choice of first words, the selection of tutors. Every detail shaped not only the child's mind, but the future of a kingdom. And mothers, aware of this, competed with nails and perfume for the attention of their teachers, trying to ensure that their children learned faster, spoke more eloquently, and demonstrated more bravery than others. The palace corridors, where children's laughter echoed among marble columns, were also silent arenas where people observed who walked first, who held the wooden scepter most firmly, who sat on the empty throne when no one was looking. These seemingly innocent gestures were read as omens, as signs of whose blood would prevail, and each mother, upon noticing the gleam in her child's eyes, knew she carried within herself not only a destiny, but the chance to inscribe her name for eternity. But a mother's power wasn't limited to her child, but rather to the way she shaped his soul. It was she who whispered stories of lineage and victories, who taught to distrust stares, who showed how to smile in the face of the enemy without ever letting one's guard down. It was she who determined which gods would be revered in the silence of the night, which customs would be preserved, which alliances would be nurtured. Each mother made her child not just a successor, but an extension of herself, perpetuating her influence even when her own strength waned. And so inheritance disputes became silent wars, as bloody as any battle fought in the fields. A son favored by the king could mean the exile of others. A child chosen by the priests could ruin years of preparation for rivals. Sometimes even the milk that fed the babies carried invisible poison. Not the poison that kills, but the one that weakens, the one that limits, the one that condemns a lineage to oblivion. In the halls of power, the future was always uncertain, and every child's laughter concealed a hidden struggle. For there, amid ivory cradles and golden toys, not only princes and princesses were born, but also instruments of manipulation, echoes of the feminine desire to immortalize themselves through blood. Ultimately, each child was a mirror. It reflected the power of the mother who bore it, and announced without her needing to say so whether the throne would belong to her or disappear like sand in the wind. The palaces of the cruelest kings were also temples of contradictions, spaces where the voices of prophets echoed outside while, in the inner corridors, hidden altars were erected in honor of foreign deities. Wives brought with them more than their bodies and perfumes. They also brought the gods of their distant lands, figures carved from rare wood, stone statuettes wrapped in colorful fabrics, small idols hidden in golden coffers that, at dusk, were removed and placed on discreet tables, transforming ordinary rooms into forbidden sanctuaries. There were nights when, as the official incense rose from the temple dedicated to the God of Israel, denser smoke spread through the inner chambers, exuding unfamiliar aromas, resins brought from Syria, oils from Egypt, mysterious powders that made the mind swim. Songs in foreign languages echoed in women's voices, and the walls, steeped in mystery, held secrets never to be recorded by the scribes. There, in the shadows, women of different nations intertwined their devotions, creating a network of hidden spirituality that silently eroded the fidelity of the throne. The kings, seduced by both the flesh and the promise of new powers, allowed, or pretended not to see, these cults to flourish. Perhaps they believed that by uniting gods they also united peoples, that by allowing hidden altars they strengthened alliances, that by listening to foreign prayers, they expanded their power over conquered lands. But this mixture was not harmony, it was dissonance, a spiritual cacophony that divided hearts and contaminated the sacred. The God of the prophets became just another voice in the chorus, and the people, confused, began to doubt whether they still walked under the protection of the old covenant or if they had been delivered to chaos. Foreign women knew this. Each ritual was more than devotion, it was a political act. Lighting a lamp before an idol also affirmed the presence of one's nation within the heart of the palace. Teaching a song to a son was planting the seeds of a different faith within him. Inviting other concubines to participate in a secret cult was creating brotherhoods of power that challenged the dominance of the chief queen or even the king himself. And there was the danger of symbols. A snake-shaped bracelet, a veil embroidered with stars, a chalice carved with fertility images. These were more than adornments. They were constant reminders that other gods circulated alive in the blood of the court. In the eyes of the prophets, each of these objects was a betrayal. In the eyes of the women, they were tools. In the eyes of the king, they were temptations. Thus, the palace became a spiritual battlefield. While the people offered sacrifices on the altars of Jerusalem, within the chambers burned the fires of Ashtoreth, Moloch, and Baal, gods whose worship required offerings that the God of Israel abhorred. And yet, these rituals grew, like weeds sprouting from ancient stone, fueled not only by the desire of women, but by the complacency of the men who desired them. It was in this interweaving of religions, in this dangerous game between the sacred and the profane, that the beginning of ruin was written. For when a king divided his soul among many altars, he lost the clarity that sustained him, and the people, seeing him bow before foreign gods, felt the weight of an invisible curse. In the heart of the throne, faith fragmented, and each fragment became a whisper of downfall. The price of pleasure is not immediately revealed. It accumulates like sweet poison, slowly dissolving the strength that sustained entire kingdoms, until, suddenly, the wall cracks, the temple is defiled, and the throne is no longer an altar, but a prison. The kings who intoxicated themselves with the golden cup of desire believed their power was eternal, that the banquets, the harems, and the secret cults would never leave their mark. But the truth is that each night of lust was a seed of decadence planted in the heart of the empire, and these seeds, watered by innocent blood and profane incense, blossomed into murmurs that the wind carried to the streets. The people, once reverent, began to grow suspicious. The squares, which echoed with trumpets in honor of the king, now whispered that the altars were defiled, that the priests had become complicit in foreign idolatries, that the blessing of the God of Israel was receding like a retreating cloud. The scribes, still obedient, recorded past victories, but their eyes betrayed unease, and even the guards, as they passed through the palace corridors, sensed that the splendor already smelled of ruin. It was in the details that the downfall was announced. The gold from the treasuries was beginning to disappear, drained to sustain insatiable luxuries. The once obedient generals murmured among themselves that wars were fought more to please female alliances than to protect borders. The prophets cried out at the city gates that the throne was tarnished, that divine wrath was approaching, but their words were drowned out by the laughter of the banquets and the sound of flutes in the inner chambers. The king, increasingly a prisoner of his desires, no longer listened to prudent advice. His eyes, blinded by silks and perfumes, failed to see the crumbling of the invisible pillars that supported his power. He believed he dominated, but was dominated. He believed he was master, but was a slave to pleasures that were never satisfied. And as he delved deeper, the kingdom fragmented. Tribes drifted apart. Enemies approached. Alliances broke. Pleasure, once sweet as honey, now tasted bitter as bile. The temple, the center of the people's spirituality, began to fill with strange echoes. Desecrated altars, divided priests, sacrifices no longer pure. The people wondered, what God still protects us if the king bows to foreign gods? This doubt, spreading like wildfire, corroded faith, and without faith, no throne remains standing. And so it was, in the silence between one banquet and another, that the fall began, not with enemy swords, but with the slow erosion caused by pleasure transformed into vice, by desire transformed into law, by the corruption that arises when one believes there are no limits. The prophecy was written, those who sow idolatry reap destruction, Those who exchange the sacred for the profane will find only ashes. But the cruelest kings ignored these signs, believing that power was eternal, and in doing so dug with their own hands the grave of their empires. And when the sound of war trumpets finally echoed off the walls, it was already too late. The enemy had not won through sheer force, but because the king had become fragile within, corroded by lust that had transformed him into a shadow of his former self. The fall was no accident, but the inevitable consequence of every cup raised, every body desired, every altar desecrated. The price of pleasure, at last, had been exacted, and exacted with interest in blood and tears. At the end of every corridor, when the incense ends and the last flame in the royal chamber flickers before dying, remains the secret that the scribes feared to write. The cruelest kings were not brought down by enemies or prophets, alone, but by an ancient thread, woven by feminine hands that learned to speak to the invisible and tame desire until it obeyed, a thread that runs through beds, altars and decrees, mingling blood and perfume, promise and enchantment. Call this thread a pact, a subterranean liturgy, a science of memory. The name matters little. What matters is that it operated like a silent tide, gathering up all the king's excesses and returning them multiplied in guilt, division, idolatry. And when the scales tipped, there was no army that could right them, because the weight came from within, from a corrupted conscience, from the sacred exchanged for the sweet sound of flutes. The secret is this: the cruelty of these men was a mirror, and mirrors in the right hands become portals. Each woman the king took as a trophy opened without fanfare, a portal between gods and desires, and through this portal entered the wind that extinguishes torches, the doubt that rots stones, the vanity that undoes alliances, the fever that makes the sword fail. No, this is not vulgar sorcery, but misguided wisdom, the same that builds houses when it returns to the heights and tears them down when it bows to idols. The wisdom of rhythm, of perfume, of pause, of the name whispered at the right time, of the story told to the prince, of the memory kindled in the heart of the tyrant. This is how power is bent, not in the clang of bronze, but in the pulse of re-educated desire. And so the fall repeats itself, as if an ancient algorithm governed the end of empires, first the mixing of gods, then the mixing of wills, finally the mixing of loyalties. When all is mixed, nothing holds, and the throne cracks like a vase under the sun. The final act takes place not at the gates, but in the bed. A decision postponed, a name scratched out, a forgotten emissary, and there it is. The wall gives way, the treasure vanishes, the prophecy finds passage. The promised mystery was hidden not in caves, but on the surface of things. The king's chamber was a temple, and whoever understood it ruled without a crown. The harem was a council, and whoever deciphered it wrote laws with the gesture of a hand. The incense of the secret altars was accounting, and whoever lit it administered ruin with the same elegance with which a dancer crosses the stage. Here is the consequence. Every power that abandons the sacred for a pleasure that wants to be God, sooner or later, bows before a whisper, and whoever learns to move. Whispers needs no sword. Some will call it a curse, others justice, others the memory of God himself traversing history and reclaiming what is his. I call it a hidden law, and it does not fail. Where desire becomes a throne, the throne learns to tremble. And as the wind extinguishes the last torch, I leave an image for those who came to the end. Between a veil placed and a cup raised, there is always a minimal gesture that decides everything. Those who recognize it read the past, but also foresee the future, and without fanfare choose which altar to remain at. If every detail of this narrative has ignited in you the feeling that there are hidden truths waiting to be revealed, don't let this be just another secret that goes unnoticed. Like it like holding a torch against the darkness, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue together opening the doors that centuries have tried to keep closed. The next mystery is already waiting, and your presence will be part of the revelation.